Harriet Warner's hand trembled slightly as she held the faded envelope in front of her, reading the elegant script that had been penned decades earlier. She was an investigative journalist, not usually prone to sentimentality, but something about this letter was different. She had discovered it tucked between the pages of an old poetry book she'd found at a flea market in London. The vendor had known nothing of its provenance, or so he claimed, but Harriet suspected he was merely uninterested. She couldn't blame him. Only someone like her, someone trained to find meaning in hidden details, would pore over the faint postmarks and half-legible addresses until the letter's mystery revealed itself. She studied the envelope under her desk lamp late into the night. Postmarked 1947, it was addressed simply to "My dearest E," with no return address. The bright ink once used for the swirling capital letters had faded to a sepia tone. She opened the envelope, glanced at its contents, and felt the yearning behind each line. The letter spoke of longing and separation, of a promise made in a rose garden before one of the world wars, and of an unbreakable bond that transcended great distance. It hinted that the writer and the recipient had been torn apart by circumstantial marriage, family expectations, and the war. Harriet's heart clenched at the raw intimacy in those few paragraphs. She decided to investigate, though it was not commissioned by her editor. The letter, in its sincerity, refused to let her rest. She had to know who wrote it and why it had never found its way to the intended recipient, or so she guessed, since it was stuffed in a random book for sale. A story formed in her mind about star-crossed lovers, passionate and poetic, whose fates were lost in the shuffle of time. She vowed to trace the letter's origin, to unravel a love long buried under decades of life's debris. Her first clue lay in the faint postmark, Berkshaw, a small village near the English coast. Harriet made a plan to drive there early the next morning, steeling herself for a long journey. She had never been to Berkshaw, with its stern coastal winds and panoramic oceanic vistas. The region was known for its rugged cliffs that descended into churning tides. The roads leading there were narrow, winding, and near desert outside of holiday months. She felt a nervous excitement as she entered the village, because rarely did a lead so completely captivate her heart and mind. This was not just an investigation for work. This was something personal, even if she didn't yet know exactly why. When Harriet finally arrived, the sun hung low in the sky, painting the water a deep orange. The village was modest, with a single main street lined by quaint shops and a centuries-old church at the far edge. Seagulls circled overhead, and salt crept into the air. She booked a room at a small bed and breakfast run by an elderly couple, Mr. and Mrs. Greeley, who led her up narrow stairs to a cozy suite overlooking the shore. The same evening, after unpacking, Harriet sat in the inn's tiny parlor and began asking discreet questions about the village's history and families of note. But no one seemed to recall a Miss E or an elaborate love story from just after the war. Although Berkshaw's secrecy frustrated her, Harriet refused to give up. She spent the following morning at the local archives, searching through old newspapers, letters, and photographs. In a battered issue of the Berkshaw Chronicle dated 1947, a small announcement caught her eye. 2 local men had returned from serving in the war, one of them named Theodore Carnegie, who was rumored to be engaged to a woman from the next parish. The article's mention of their separate heartbreaks teased Harriet. She wondered if Theodore had written the letter or if he was a piece in a larger puzzle. The more she thought about it, the more she became convinced that she had found a thread worth pulling. Digging deeper, Harriet learned that Theodore was an only child who passed away in the early 1950s, leaving behind no direct heirs. But a side note scrawled in an old parish ledger hinted that Theodore had an aunt who later emigrated to the United States, and her descendants had only recently come back to England. Harriet's perseverance paid off when she discovered a short genealogical record that listed an A. Carnegie as the current occupant of the old family cottage on the outskirts of Berkshaw. Without hesitation, Harriet jotted down the address and decided to pay this A. Carnegie a visit. Late that afternoon, she navigated her small rental car past the village boundary. The cottage stood by a grassy cliff, separated from the road by a narrow gravel lane. Ivy crept up the sides of the stone walls, and a garden of untended wildflowers swayed gently in the breeze. Harriet's heart fluttered with anticipation as she approached. She had no way of knowing how this A. Carnegie would respond to her questions, and whether she'd even be welcomed. Still, she had the letter's mystery at her side, buoying her forward. She knocked on the front door, which bore scratches from decades of wind and salty air. A few moments later, a man opened it. He was in his early 30s, perhaps, with disheveled dark hair and green eyes reminiscent of the sea foam swirling along the coast. His button-down shirt was partially unbuttoned, revealing a casual ease, as though he was used to isolation and didn't often expect visitors. "Yes?" he asked, his voice tinged with curiosity and caution. "Hello," Harriet began, extending her hand too hastily. "My name is Harriet Warner. I'm an investigative journalist, and I'm here researching an old letter that might have ties to your family. May I come in?" The man studied her for a moment before nodding. "I'm Arthur Carnegie," he said, stepping aside so she could enter. The cottage's interior was warm, with a soft fireplace glow and walls lined with shelves of books. It felt lived in, uncomfortable, undemanding. After leading Harriet to a modest living room, Arthur waited until he was settled in an armchair before he gestured for Harriet to sit on the worn leather sofa opposite him. Arthur listened intently as Harriet explained the circumstances surrounding the letter. She was careful not to reveal too many personal conjectures, but enough to pique his interest. Gently, she offered the letter to him. He slipped on reading glasses and read it quietly, his brow furrowing with each line. When he finally looked up, his eyes were misted with thought. "I've never seen this letter before," he said softly, "but I recognize the handwriting. It's in some of the family diaries I inherited from my grandfather. This isn't Theodore's letter. My grandfather mentioned his cousin Theodore in some entries. But the handwriting actually belongs to another relative, named Henry Carnegie." That was unexpected. Harriet leaned forward, her pulse quickening. "Henry Carnegie? That name didn't come up in the archives." Arthur shook his head. "He left Berkshire during the war and never returned. There are only passing references to him in the diaries, a few notes about a passionate love affair, something that caused a stir in the family, but it's vague. I wish I could offer more, but I need time to search through my grandfather's belongings. They're in some old crates in the attic." A flicker of excitement darted through Harriet's chest. She could sense that Arthur was intrigued, perhaps even drawn to solve the puzzle himself. The two of them agreed to collaborate. Harriet would help Arthur sort through the diaries and letters in the attic, seeing if they could discover Henry's path and, most crucially, the identity of my dearest E. The next day, Harriet arrived with coffee and pastries. Together, they climbed into the attic crammed with boxes labeled in spidery handwriting. Dust motes floated lazily in the beams of sunlight that filtered through a small window. The space was musty, and Harriet had to stifle a sneeze as she opened a box of old books. Hours passed in silence as they read fragments of the Carnegie family's story, each piece weaving a tapestry of love, hardship, and survival throughout the war-torn years. Eventually, Harriet stumbled across a journal that seemed to belong to Henry. On the inside cover, Henry's name and address in London were neatly penned. She and Arthur pored over the entries, written in a bold, flourished hand. The final entries were particularly telling. Henry wrote of a woman named Evangeline Gould, she beat E, with whom he had fallen desperately in love just before being stationed abroad. Evangeline's father disapproved of the match. She was from a prominent family and already promised to another man. The heartbreak Henry poured onto those pages was unmistakable, culminating in an entry ranting against fate for tearing them apart. Then, abruptly, the journal ended. There were no further notes about Henry or his star-crossed love, no mention of whether they had one final meeting. Harriet felt a pang of sorrow for Henry. She knew all too well how societal dictates could smother fragile passions. An ache formed in her chest at the thought of a letter never reaching the one person it was meant for. That evening, with the journal in hand, Harriet and Arthur settled in the cottage's living room. The fire burned, casting dancing shadows across the walls. They talked about what they'd uncovered, hypothesizing about Evangeline's story, how she might have felt, forced into a marriage while her real love, Henry, was overseas. Arthur grew thoughtful, and his expression turned wistful as he looked at Harriet. She felt a spark pass between them, something unspoken yet present in the space around them. It was as though they both sensed that tracing this old love story was forging a connection between them, bridging the distance between past and present, stirring compassion and yearning neither had expected. Harriet tried to ignore the warmth that filled her stomach whenever Arthur smiled. In the days that followed, Harriet interviewed locals who remembered rumors about the Carnegies, though many stories had grown muddled over time. She visited the church records, discovered a funeral announcement for Evangeline's father in 1950, and an unremarkable marriage record for Evangeline herself. But matching the timeline, Harriet couldn't confirm if Henry ever glimpsed her again after he penned his letter. Meanwhile, she and Arthur spent hours sifting through material. Their companionship felt natural. An unlikely friendship formed over dusty archives and half-lost memories. They laughed at Henry's dramatic, poetic style. Harriet teased Arthur about his diet of tea and biscuits. They ordered takeout from the lone cafe in town when they were too immersed in research to cook. In these small, private moments, Harriet found herself lingering on Arthur's gaze a little too long, or brushing shoulders with him when they leaned over a box of documents. Something fragile and hopeful was beginning to blossom between them. After nearly a week of digging, a breakthrough arrived in the form of an old photograph Harriet found tucked behind the attic beams. The photograph was black and white, capturing a young man, presumably Henry, and a graceful woman wearing a sun hat. Harriet was very grateful when she found it. They stood in a rose garden. The setting matched the description from the mysterious letter. On the back, someone had scrawled H&E, 1946, Our Secret Garden. Harriet felt her heart soar. This woman wasn't the fiancée of Evangeline's father's designs. This was Evangeline herself, free from the constraints of her father's watchful gaze. Now, Harriet had a real clue that connected the photograph, the letter, and the journal. For the first time, she had tangible evidence of Henry and Evangeline's clandestine bond. Arthur held the photograph gently, as if afraid it would crumble. He traced the outline of Henry's face. "He looks so happy," Arthur murmured. "I wonder how it all went so wrong." Aware of the complexities of heartbreak, Harriet sighed. "We only know a fraction of what happened, but this photo is proof of a love they shared. I wish we could confirm if Evangeline ever read the letter." Arthur turned the photograph over in his hands. "Maybe there's still someone alive who might know what happened," he suggested. "This garden, they called it Our Secret Garden. It might be on a property that still exists. If we can find that place, there might be old caretakers, old neighbors who recall the families." Harriet felt a wave of excitement. "You're absolutely right. Old gardens like that were usually part of an estate. Evangeline's family was prominent, so perhaps it belonged to her family home." She paused, uncertain if it was too bold an assumption. "I can research the owners of local estates from that period, or we can head to the next parish, where Evangeline's father was said to have property." Arthur nodded, a determined light in his eyes. "Let's do it." That afternoon, they climbed into Arthur's car and drove through winding lanes to a grand estate just outside the next parish, rumored to once belong to Evangeline's wealthy relatives. After some hesitation, an older woman named Mrs. O'Rourke greeted them at the estate's gatehouse. She had been the caretaker of the property for nearly 4 decades. When Harriet and Arthur showed her the photograph, Mrs. O'Rourke's eyes lit with recognition. She remembered working briefly under an elderly gentleman who spoke wistfully of a lost daughter named Evangeline. Mrs. O'Rourke pointed them toward the remains of a once sea beautiful rose garden behind the main house. Walking through the grounds, Harriet felt a palpable echo of the past. Though the rose bushes were unkempt and overgrown, the marble fountain remained at the center, waterless and cracked, but still bearing the marks of a bygone splendor. She and Arthur wandered the perimeter, searching for any plaque, any hidden lover's initials carved into a bench or tree. Even without discovering physical confirmation, they knew they stood where Henry and Evangeline had once pledged their devotion. Harriet looked at Arthur, imagining the stolen kisses Henry must have plucked from Evangeline's lips in that very spot. She felt Arthur's closeness and shivered as a breeze rolled off the nearby fields. They thanked Mrs. O'Rourke for her time but left with mixed emotions. On the one hand, they had found a vital piece of Henry and Evangeline's story. On the other, they still had no idea if Evangeline ever received that letter. As they drove back to Berkshaw, late afternoon sunlight slanted through the car windows, soaking Harriet and Arthur in a golden glow. She felt the brush of his arm against hers on the narrow car seat, and her breath caught. The feeling wasn't just warmth from the sun. It was something deeper, an awareness of how an old romance had drawn them together. She wondered if a new story was unfolding for them, perhaps sparked by the ghosts of Henry and Evangeline. Back at the cottage, Harriet helped Arthur prepare a simple dinner. He opened a bottle of wine, and they sat together at the small kitchen table, candlelight flickering over their faces. Conversation ranged from the day's discoveries to personal confessions. Harriet confessed how her work often pulled her away from any meaningful connections, leaving her feeling rootless. Arthur spoke of how a messy divorce 2 years ago had led him to Berkshaw, hoping the quiet might restore his wounded heart. Though they spoke softly, each word made Harriet feel more connected to Arthur. A fine thread of understanding and caring grew between them. After dinner, they drifted to the living room, where Harriet, driven by impulse, retrieved the letter from her bag. She skimmed it once more before turning to Arthur. "I think I finally understand what drew me to this letter," she murmured. "I've been so guarded, so afraid to let myself feel anything. But this, Henry and Evangeline, sometimes I think they're reminding us that love is worth the risk." Arthur's eyes were steady. "I've felt it too," he admitted. "I was hesitant to say anything. But, Harriet, I'm drawn to you. Meeting you, digging into this old tragedy, it's awakened something in me. There's a beauty in seeing how fragile life and love can be, and how we shouldn't waste any more time than we must." She set the letter aside carefully and reached out to him. He took her hand. Their lips curled into shy smiles as they leaned closer, hesitating for a split second before gently touching foreheads. A silent electricity filled the few inches of space between them. Then, with tender caution, Arthur pressed his lips to Harriet's. She sank into that fleeting moment of warmth and understanding, realizing that while she had sought an old flame from the past, she might have lit a new one in the present. They never definitively proved if Evangeline had read Henry's letter, though Harriet later discovered a wedding announcement listing Evangeline as a bride in 1950, well after Henry had written the letter. The marriage didn't last long, records suggested, but there was no mention of a reunion with Henry. Perhaps Henry never returned, or maybe life swept them down separate paths. Yet there was comfort in knowing that the letter's existence had thrived, bridging time to weave a new romance. Harriet decided to write an article that not only described the history of Henry and Evangeline, but also revealed the power of a single message to echo across generations. In the following months, Harriet continued to visit Arthur in Berkshaw. She watched the seasons change along the rugged coast, letting the salty wind whip at her hair as she strolled with him along the cliff tops. Their late-night talks were full of laughter and, at times, tears, as they swapped small pieces of themselves they had long guarded. Whenever Harriet gazed at the old letter, now framed on a mantel in Arthur's cottage, It reminded her of the swirling undercurrents that connect hearts, transcending time. Although she never expected to become part of the story she was investigating, Harriet recognized that the best news stories weren't just about capturing events. They were also about capturing the beating heart of experience. Word of her article traveled. Curious readers wrote to her, sharing stories of their own undiscovered heirlooms and family love letters. Though Harriet appreciated the attention, it was the deeper meaning that stayed with her, how history's footprints guide us to truths about our own frailties and desires. She and Arthur, in embroidering Henry and Evangeline's story, had found the courage to own their own. They had learned that sometimes love comes from the most unexpected places, like a flea market book, waiting patiently for just the right person to open the pages. One chilly autumn evening, just before Harriet left for a few weeks in London, she and Arthur walked to the cliff's edge near the Carnegie cottage. The sun was setting, igniting the sky with brilliant pinks and oranges. The ocean below roared as it collided with the rocks, echoing the thunder that Harriet felt in her chest whenever she looked at Arthur. He slipped his hand around hers. In that instant, Harriet recalled the letter's first lines, words that spoke of undying devotion. She thought about Henry and Evangeline, about roads not taken. Then she thought about the path she and Arthur now tread, uncertain but hopeful. She turned to Arthur, her cheeks flushed from the wind and from something deeper. "For whatever reason, I was meant to find that letter," she said softly. "I'm finding parts of myself I didn't know I had." Arthur smiled, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "And I'm finding there's more to life than running from the past. Maybe all of us are just searching for someone who can help carry our histories, our hopes, and even our regrets." A comfortable silence enveloped them. Arthur gently pressed his lips to hers, and Harriet let her eyes close, immersed in the warmth of that moment. She felt the chill of the wind on her back, the sound of waves in her ears, and the steady beat of Arthur's heart under her hand. For the first time, Harriet believed that the future could hold promise beyond the next headline or the next investigation. It could hold love, an inheritance of emotion passed down through the ghosts of an old letter, through the hearts of two people bold enough to discover its secret. And so, though Harriet would soon return to London, part of her remained in Berkshire, present in every wave that rolled onto the jagged shore, and in every hidden corner of the cottage attic. She and Arthur promised each other that once she finished her assignment, she'd come back to comb through the rest of the family documents. They would piece together Henry's life, not for the sake of heartbreak, but to ensure that his love story, however tragic or incomplete, would be remembered. Because in the end, it wasn't about proving that Henry's love had a happy resolution. It was about ensuring that it had mattered, that it had shaped the heartbreak and hope that survived him. Before Harriet left, they took one final walk through the rose garden ruins at Evangeline's old estate. The caretaker let them in, and the late season roses clung to life despite the gathering of fallen leaves. Harriet plucked a rose, careful of its fragile petals. She laid it on the crest of the dried fountain, silently acknowledging Henry and Evangeline's romance. Then she looked at Arthur, addressing him with her eyes, letting him see her vulnerability and her desire to explore whatever symphony of feeling they had begun together. He slipped his hand around her waist. They stood there for a long while, listening to the hush of the afternoon and the echo of footsteps that had once trod that same path, searching for hope in the midst of an uncertain world. Once the article was published, readers wrote to Harriet, praising the bittersweet nature of Henry and Evangeline's love, and marveling at how it had connected Harriet and Arthur. She never disclosed all of the details about her own blossoming feelings for Henry's descendant. Some stories were meant for the private realm of the heart, but her writing shone with the tenderness she had found, capturing the sense of wonder and loss that pulses through the human experience. The letter that changed everything had indeed found its way into open air, forging a link between past longing and present possibility. And so Harriet's investigation culminated not in a tidy resolution, but in a testament to the power of stories and the promises carried in every letter, every photograph, and every whisper of emotion. The tale of Henry Carnegie and Evangeline remained incomplete, wrapped in the mists of a bygone era where heartbreak and war overshadowed youthful dreams. Yet in that unfinished space, Harriet discovered that some fires never truly die. They glow softly, waiting to be discovered by those brave enough and hopeful enough to rekindle them.